standing up and singing together a tikva. I'm not sure about time, maybe when we finish. Naftali Herz Imber.
All the verses? All the verses?
Just our version. Naftali Herz Imber is very, very famous in Israel as Zionist, early Zionist poet, and especially, or almost solely, as the author of the national anthem Hatikva, the Hope. Also, I think he is quite known in Israel for his questionable character. A bohemian, penniless vagabond, a schnorrer, which I don't know how to translate in English, and mostly as a drunk. Much less known is Imber's interest in Western esotericism in Kabbalah. He wrote and lectured about Kabbalah, and he published the first ever journal of Kabbalah, Uriel, which only one issue of it came out. What I would like to do today is to speak about Imber's interest in the occult, and especially about his perception of Kabbalah, which, as I will show, was influenced by the mystic and occult groups he was in touch with, and especially the Oliphants and the Theosophical Society. I would like to show that Imber's interest in Kabbalah was related to his Zionist convictions. For Imber, Jewish national reviver was a modern continuation of Kabbalah, an idea quite similar to other Zionist thinkers, most famous Gershom Scholem. I will argue that Imber's Zionism and interest in Kabbalah were, similar to other Jewish thinkers, embedded in Oriental discourse and in Jewish self-Orientalism. For Imber, forward to the east, Lefa'atei Mizrach Kadima, is a return to Zion, as well as to Kabbalah, as perceived by him under the impact of Western esotericism. I will start with a short survey of the biography of Imber and his Zionist activities. Imber was born in 1856 in Zlochov, in Ukraine, then in the Austrian Empire. He became close to the circle of the Maskilim in Zlochov, and later in Brody and Lemberg, and started writing, as really a child, writing Hebrew poetry. In his late teens and early 20s, he traveled through Vienna, Budapest, and Romania. There, he says, he wrote the first version of Hatikva in 1877. He arrived in Istanbul, and there he met the famous English writer, politician, adventurer, mystic, Zionist, that we now know a lot more about him, Lawrence Oliphant, and his wife, Alice. He was hired as Oliphant's secretary, and in 1882 arrived with the Oliphants to Palestine. He stayed in Palestine for 5 years. Part of the time in the Oliphant's house in Haifa, and again, as you already know, in the Druze village in Dalia. The house today is a memorial house for the Druze IDF casualties, Bet Yad Labanim, and there's the plaque there that mentions that Oliphant, you can see that Imber lived in this house with the Oliphants. But apart from staying with the Oliphants, he also stayed for quite a while in Jerusalem. He traveled for about half a year, I think, to Egypt. He visited the new Jewish colonies and wrote poems in their praise. He was also involved in the revolt of the Jewish colonists against the inspectors of Baron Rothschild, entered a fierce controversy with Eliezer ben Yehuda, another hero of early Zionism, and also had quite tense relations with the Oliphants, the reason of which is not clear. He published poems and articles in the Hebrew newspaper journals of the period in Jerusalem, Chachavatzelet and Atzvi, and in 80, that's Naftali Herz in his youth, and in 1886 he published his first book of poems, Barkai, which he dedicated to Lawrence Oliphant. In 1887, he left Palestine. He arrived in London and stayed there for about 4 years. He lectured, published articles in Yiddish, Hebrew, and English, mostly in the Jewish Standard and Jewish Orthodox newspaper. He was supported, he was drinking a lot, he was schnorring a lot. He was supported by the author Israel Zangweil, which portrayed Imber hilariously as the neo-Hebrew poet Pinchas Malkitzedek in his novel The Children of the Ghetto, published in 1892, and it's a worthwhile reading. In 1891, Imber left England to America, and there he stayed, traveling in various locations until his death in New York in 1909. He was supported there, again, he always found someone to support him, by Judge Meyer Sulzbacher from Philadelphia, and again lived in great poverty, continuing to drink excessively. For less than a year, in 1899, he was married, but the marriage didn't hold on for very long. And again, he continued publishing articles, poems, the Kabbalistic journal that I mentioned before, 2 more Hebrew poetry books, a translation to Hebrew of Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat, based on Fitzgerald's English, and some booklets on different topics, mostly Talmudic, mystical, and Kabbalistic. The last of those is the Treasure of Two Words, which was published in 1910 after his death. Through his life, Imber was an enthusiastic Zionist before, as Isaac said, before Zionism really existed. He was close to the Chovevei Zion, the lovers of Zion, the early Zionist groups in East Europe that emerged in the late 1880s. And his poetry, if anyone considers it much, and most literary experts don't consider it much, but it's considered as part of the Chibat Zion literature. He arrived in Palestine in 1882, the exact year, the beginning of the Aliyah Rishonah, the first wave of Zionist-inspired immigration. And as I mentioned before, he visited the colonies, he was involved in the colonist revolt, and he wrote poems in the praise of the early colonies. The national Zionist sentiments are central in his writing, especially in his poems. He was never considered as an important poet, as I said. His personality and drinking habits were an embarrassment to the Zionist establishment. Yet, Hatikva, our hope, became popular first in the Jewish colonies, and then it was they began singing it in the tune that it's today sung. It started as the first Zionist conventions and the World Zionist Congresses. It spontaneously it was sung until in 1933 the Zionist Congress chose it as the national anthem of the Jewish people. It became the anthem of the State of Israel, although declared as the anthem by law only in 2004. Imber defined himself, adhered to Zionism, and defined himself as Zionist all his life, although being such an embarrassment to the Zionist movement. Thousands came to his funeral in 1909, and in 1953 he was reburied in Israel. To show that before. Imber was interested and had contacts with several occult and mystical groups. First and foremost with the Oliphants, and through them with the ideas of Herz. And I don't have to say, skip here a little bit, because you know by now a lot about Herz and the Oliphant ideas. Maybe instead of this little bit, I will just read from Imber's introduction, because it's the presentation of his Uriel, the Kabbalistic journal that he published. And there he speaks about Oliphant. 25 years ago, he abandoned Christianity under the influence of his friend Mr. Harris, an American ex-clergyman. Mr. Harris is a man of extraordinary poetical powers. His chief doctrine is that God is bisexual, a dual conception not unknown to Talmud and the Kabbalah. As is the maker, so is his creation. In the male resides something of the feminine, in the female, something of the masculine. And I skip a little bit. Mr. Oliphant took up these ideas and developed them. Working heart and soul for others was declared by him to be the best and only true method of worship. The religion of labor was the name he gave the new faith, and he and his wife worked here for 7 years. Here he means the States. Here for 7 years at manual labor, eating only bread and potatoes, so as to purge themselves of earthly desires and prepare themselves for absorption into the divine essence. When I first met him in Constantinople in 1882, my own Kabbalistic mysticism no doubt had its influence on him. Okay. We'll get back, and I think we'll see later the influence of Oliphant's ideas on Imber. Apart from the Oliphant's and Harris's idea, Imber was familiar with the ideas of the Theosophical Society and Blavatsky. And in the United States, he had contacts with Theosophists. He participated in theosophical conventions and relates that the members of the Theosophical Society helped him publish one of his books and had interest in him translating the Zohar. He was quite ambivalent in regard to the Theosophical Society. On the one hand, he had some, let's say, positive things to say about Blavatsky. This is an article of him, again from Uriel, called Madame Blavatsky Unveiled, and he starts, "All respect to Madame Blavatsky. Shut your mouths, you scandal mongers and slanderers. For this alone is a proof of how great was Madame Blavatsky. Indeed, she did more for the elevation of mankind than many of the ministers, for she was the preparer of a new age, a new dispensation to womanhood, heralding the rising of that ill-treated sex. She was the first to point out to the people the spirit of things existing between heaven and earth, of which our schoolmasters never dreamed. But, for all her nobility, she was only a pointer, and that was all." In other places, he's much more critical. He speaks about the resemblance between Kabbalah and Theosophy, but says the Kabbalah was older and much superior. He claims that Blavatsky took her ideas from Jews she met in Russia and distorted them. Notwithstanding this criticism, he was much influenced by theosophical ideas, and as we will see later, he calls the Hasidim the Jewish Theosophists, and calls Kabbalist and Hasidic masters Mahatmas. Okay. Apart from Oliphant's Esotericism and the Theosophical Society, he was acquainted naturally with Freemasonry. He wrote, if you see, Uriel is published as a Masonic edition, and in it he has a greeting to the Masons, which he says that he delivered in the Masonic meeting in Boston in 1895, and he has only praises for the Masons, claims that Talmudic sages were Masons, and he borrows some notions of Freemasonry in his description of Kabbalah. Finally, the last and fascinating connection, which only last week I made, Imber had some kind of contact with the Corician movement. The Coricians were the followers of Cyrus Steed, was a mystic and self-proclaimed messiah whose ideas were quite similar to those of Thomas Lake Harris. It can be included in the survey that you gave, also advocating celibacy and establishing a few communes for agricultural life. Imber publishes a small article in The Flaming Sword, which was the journal of the Corinthians. He calls, very interestingly, the small articles, he calls it Salam Alaikum. Yeah, and he says that this is the address that he wanted to give to the 1893 Parliament of World Religions, in which he was not included. Apart from that, I don't know about this connection, but I think there's something interesting here. Imber developed various ideas and adopted various ideas and expressions from all these Western esoteric groups and integrated them in his work, especially in his perception of Kabbalah, and that is what I will move now to. Imber was very much interested in Kabbalah. He presented himself as an expert in Kabbalah, and says that his interest in Kabbalah and mysticism began already in his youth in Zlochov. He tells, of course, that he was taught Kabbalah by an unknown old Kabbalist in Zlochov just before he died. Although he definitely had some knowledge of Kabbalah, he's definitely no expert in Kabbalah and seems to have only scant knowledge of Kabbalistic literature. Probably his interest in Kabbalah was enhanced by the Oliphants. It became central in his writing and activities, especially in America. In 1893, he attempts to open a class for Kabbalah in Boston. And in August 1895, he publishes his Uriel, a monthly magazine devoted to Kabbalistic science. In his last publication, Treasure of Two Worlds, he has several articles on Kabbalah and translations and commentaries to passages from the Zohar and to Third Enoch. Imber develops his own vision of Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, which is inspired much by the theories of the Oliphants and the Masonic and Theosophic ideas. And I must say, not always consistent, but I will try to give you a bit of a picture of his Kabbalistic ideas. In the spirit of Western esoteric perception of Kabbalah, Imber emphasizes the universal message of Kabbalah. The sealed book of life, here, the sealed book of life will be opened by the key of the Kabbalah. For only the Kabbalah is the divine science which will be welcomed in every home, reaching every class of people without any distinction of denomination, for it bears only on its face the sacred sign of truth. The popes in the Vaticans were students of that sacred science, as well as the Jews in the various countries and ages. And every spiritual scrutinizer is pointing to the Kabbalah. Kabbalah for Imber is ancient knowledge, mystical science, especially, you will not be surprised, the recognition of the bisexual nature of the divine. And this knowledge preserved and transmitted by the Jews. Of all the nations, the primitive Hebrew race alone has preserved in its lore the primordial conception of a dual God in all its purity. Of course, under the term of primitive Hebrew, we do not include the rabbinical Jews, or the ancient Hebrews of the Mosaic stock. We mean the primitive Hebrews of the patriarchal age who worshipped the combined dual deity, male and female, under the name of Elohim. This word is plural. For Imber, the first and most important Kabbalistic work is not the Zohar, but Sefer Yetzirah, written by Abraham. As we can already, I think, see here, Imber adopts the originally Christian Kabbalistic distinction between rabbinic legalistic Judaism and mystical spiritual Kabbalistic Judaism. He says that later we have development of two trends in Judaism, the priesthood and the prophets. That the Jews had the mission to preserve the truth of higher spirituality can be readily discerned by reading the history of this wonderful race. Beginning with the advent of Moses, we notice two kinds of institution of learning were established. The one under the auspices of the priesthood, the other under the care of the prophets. And I'm skipping a little bit here. As the priests delivered orally their laws to the nation, so likewise did the prophets communicate to their disciples the secrets of the higher science of spirituality. Later development, at the time of the Second Temple, the heirs of the priests were, of course, the Pharisees, and the heirs of the mystic prophets were the Essenes. At the time of the Second Temple, the priesthood lost much of its former glory, and the prophets were held in less esteem. At this same period, under the supervision of the Pharisees, the priests began to write down their laws. And the mystics, under the direction of their organization, the Essenes, began also to reduce to writing their scientific spiritual experience. From the priests, we derived the Talmud. From the Essenes, we received the Zohar, the light, the Bible of the Kabbalists and mystics. Now, this picture is a bit more complicated because he claims that the Christians seceded from the Essenes. While the secession of the early Christian gradually became more and more complete, the old party of the Essenes adhered steadfastly to their primal faith in the Shekhinah, the divine motherhood. Among the latter we find many men famous for their mystic learning, such men as Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son Rabbi Eliezer. These men lived just after the destruction of the Second Temple and were, and here we get some theosophy, they were the original Mahatmas, to whom is ascribed the preparation of the famous book, again the Zohar, which is to the mystics and Kabbalists what the Bible is to rabbinical Jews. After this period, the composition of the Zohar, Imber says that the revival of mysticism took place only with Isaac Luria. Of course, because for him the Zohar is so early. Isaac Luria, again, that great Mahatma, a record of whose wonderful life is given in its proper place. He outlined a system for obtaining spiritual power, known as the Luria system, by bringing one's body into subjection to the mind through fasting and abstinence from earthly pleasures. And I think you can see all along, I don't have to emphasize it too much, that we hear Sempnomata all along. Okay. After Luria, the almost last stage of Jewish mysticism is Hasidism. About 150 years ago, a man named Israel Baal Shem Tov, man of good name, appeared in Russia as a Mahatma and became the founder of the Hasidim, pious ones, a sort of Jewish theosophists who believe in their Mahatmas, the wonder rabbis, who are known in the Jewish world as the good Jews. The system of Israel, the great Mahatma, conflicts with that of Luria. His idea is that a man cannot attain the highest station of spirituality except by happy disposition idealized as joy. His theory makes joy the ladder up which man can climb heavenward and thus converse with the angels. Okay, so that's short Imber's perception of the nature of Kabbalah and its history. But what is interesting that that according to Imber's perception, the continuation of Besht and Hasidism, which in turn continued the trend of the ancient prophetic Judaism, that's the Essenes and the ancient Kabbalists, and later and later the Besht, which represent the vital and mystic aspect of Judaism, which he contrasts all time with the certified, legalistic, rabbinic Judaism. The continuation for that is, you will not be surprised, is Zionism. In an interesting passage published in Menorah in 1905, in 1903, he presents Hasidism as the catalyst for Jewish enlightenment, Jewish literary revival, and Jewish nationalism, reminiscent of the perception which later underlined the historiography of Gershom Scholem. The stern rabbis of the Talmud made religion a dry mechanism, according to whose regimen the Hebrew walked in his ghetto devoid of any hope and cheer. At that time, our hero, and that is the Besht, the Baal Shem Tov, appeared on the Jewish stage, and by his action he saved our national hope and blew new life into the dead bones of the scattered children of Israel. I am an admirer of our above-mentioned hero, for he was the indirect factor and cause of our modern advanced Jewish knowledge. Through the friction between his followers and those of the sturdy Talmudists, a new electric life came into action, and the party of the Maskilim, the enlightened, came into existence. The era had produced the tremendous treasures of modern Russian Hebrew literature, which woke up its slumbering nation from its delusive dreams to realize what it was and what it ought to do to become a nation again. Okay, so I would like to conclude. I think that in the last passage, we can see that Imber's Zionism and interest in the occult and Kabbalah are related. Kabbalah is the vital, primordial, non-halachic Jewish mysticism which brought about Jewish enlightenment and finally Jewish national revival. Thus, for Imber, Zionism is not only a return to the homeland of the Jews, but also a revival of Jewish anti-rabbinic mystical science, which originated and was developed in ancient prophetic Israel in Palestine. Lefa'atei Mizrach Kadima, forward to the east, is a return to the east, to Palestine, to the place of the original ancient Israelite worship of the dual deity. Imber's Zionists and his interest in esotericism and Kabbalah are both embedded in European Orientalist discourse, in the self-Orientalism of Jewish intellectuals in the turn of the 20th century. Imber, like other Jewish intellectuals, adopts the Western perception of the Orient, but applies it to their own self-perception as Jews. For them, the return to Zion is the return to their original or Oriental roots, but as perceived in the West. In Western perception, the Orient is perceived many times as esoteric and mystic. Hence, for many Jews, similar to other Oriental culture, and I think this brings us to your remark about Oliphant in India, national identity is perceived and constructed in relation to their mystical and spiritual culture. And for the Jews, this mystical Oriental spiritual culture is identified with Kabbalah. Kabbalah for them represents the authentic Oriental vital spirit of Judaism. Now this perception, I think, is typical to various Jewish Zionist and national scholars in the early 20th century, such as Hillel Zeitlin, and Martin Buber, the Prague Bar Kokhba group, circle, and of course, Gershom Scholem. Imber was definitely much less of a serious scholar than those 20th century intellectuals. But I think before them, yes, we can see the construction of a similar connection between Zionism, mysticism, and Kabbalah, a nexus which I believe is informed and constructed in the context of Jewish Orientalism. Thank you.